Okay na po tayo sa Zoom. Thank you so much. So we're down to our two last seminars for this semester. Today we'll have Dr. De Dios. Next week we'll have Dr. Lisa Bersales. But let me introduce Professor Noel De Dios. He is a former dean of the UP School of Economics, and he's a prolific writer and has authored or co-authored notable books and articles. And they were given recognition from the National Academy of Science and Technology, the Catholic Mass Media Awards, and the UNDP. A founding member of the Human Development Network, he has been involved since the beginning in preparing all editions of the Philippine Human Development Report. His research interests include institutions and economic development, theory of individual choice, history of economic thought, and international economics. He obtained his AB Economics cum laude from the other university across Katipunan, and both his MA and PhD in economics from UP Diliman. By the way, are you member of SAGE? You have to recruit him. Samahan ng mga Atenistang graduate ng economics. Oh. Yan, i-recruit lang kayo ni Gabi. He later on pursued postdoctoral studies at the University Constance in Germany. Let us all welcome Professor Noel De Dios.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll start with my slides, if it will work. How does it work? Down. Oh, down. So this is the title of my talk, Spanish Commercial Policy in the Philippines, an integrative approach. It's a puzzling title. I have a subtitle. Notes, nuts, and knots. You heard Carl say what my interests were, and they don't include economic history. So history of thought is not economic history. But I fell into a rabbit hole. I started by writing an article regarding Manuel Azcárraga, who was born in the Philippines and made a career as a politician in Spain. He wrote, I think, an important book called Free Trade in the Philippines. And that's a book that I translated, and I was intending to write an introduction for it. And in the course of that, I said I need to get a background of what was happening during that time. And that's the rabbit hole that made me study, forced me to study, mostly 19th century commercial policy of Spain as it affected the Philippines. But you wouldn't be able to do that without going even further back. And so I wrote a paper, it's with Carl, about commercial policy of Spain in general. But what I'll do this afternoon is a portion of that. I cannot go through 1570 to 1898, okay? So 1896. So this is more of an illustration of an approach that I hope I can continue to pursue, but which I also think might benefit a lot of professional historians. And this is the approach of taking a cosmopolitan view of Philippine history. We are used to a very nationalist colonial viewpoint of the colony. Somebody, an entity that is, subjugated and oppressed. But I think there is some virtue, if only to complement that viewpoint, to transcending the viewpoint of a slave or a colonized person and moving up to the level of the master or the colonizer. The reason for this is that we need to move beyond the history that says things just happen to us. The question is, why did these things happen? What were the ideas and influence, who were the agents that motivated the colonizers to do what they did? That means we have to um, study the thinking behind the colonial policies that were implemented in the Philippines in order to understand why they changed, what the system or change in vision was, and why it failed or succeeded. Unless we do that, we will all just be in the situation of saying, oh, Spain did this, Spain did that, the US did this, the US did that. Why? And I think, I hope you will share that viewpoint in the end, but what I'll do today is to show how that kind of an approach might help us in understanding what would otherwise be already familiar facts and events in the Philippines that affected the Philippines. So I think we can start with the galleon trade, which most people are familiar with. As you know, this was an exchange between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico. That's a print of Acapulco, which involved the exchange of silver that was mined in Mexico, and Mexico was very abundant in that mineral, in exchange for Oriental goods, for much of the period Chinese, that arrived in the Philippines. And of course, the economics behind this is also well known. China had a strong appetite for silver because under the Ming Dynasty, taxes were supposed to be paid in silver coin rather than the brass that was used by ordinary people. And the more economic point, which is that China at that time was growing. So according to O'Rourke, it's a case of M equals KPY. Y was growing, so the demand for money was also increasing. And in that sense, there was a need for extra currency, which at that time happened to be conveniently provided by Mexico. So this was a profitable exchange of things like porcelain. Silk was very special at the time, and Mexican silver, sometimes in the form of coin, as you see in that picture, sometimes in the form of ingots or taels, which is fairly rough forms of the silver, but exact in weight. All right, so we're all familiar with that thing. A lot has been written. History books about the period would not be complete without a very nice description of the galleon trade. Oh, by the way, the classic here is still Schurz. I don't know if it's American or German. Schurz, the Manila Galleon. It came out in 1950s. And it's still a great, most detailed description of the galleon trade. But if you look at the galleon trade, what's happening? Ah, there. That is the route of the galleons, right? I'll stand up. So here you have that relationship between Manila and China, where, as you all know, what was happening was the Chinese junks were coming to Manila, knowing that they could sell their goods to, in exchange for silver, which would be coming from Mexico. So this was the route. The route to Mexico went approaching Japan, and this was a much easier route, the return route going to the Philippines. There's this little thing because some of the cargo was also spices from the Moluccas. All right, so we're familiar with that kind of a route, but what we don't always emphasize is that it's part of a global system. There is this other thing, which is the relationship between Spain itself and its American colonies. And the center of that exchange is Sevilla, and later on Cadiz, which had the monopoly of the trade with the Americas. And this exchange had to do with the shipment of European goods to the Americas in exchange for silver. Again, the commodity which was of interest was the silver, which of course the Spaniards also owned. There are little arrows there because there are other ports that I'll describe it later, the fleet system or flota system served. So from Sevilla, a fleet of ships would go to Cuba. One port was Havana. Another port was Portobelo, which is now in Panama. And the third port was the very important port of Veracruz in Mexico, or what used to be known as New Spain. From Portobelo, the goods that were delivered from Seville were meant to serve Peru. Let me talk about that. So the main act in that global system was always Spanish America. So you have a few people who have misconceptions that the Chinese goods ended up mainly in Spain. No, some did, but the main market was always Spanish America. And at the start, I'll show a map later, there were just two big so-called viceroyalties in Spanish America. That was New Spain, which is now Mexico, and the other one was the viceroyalty of Peru, which you'll see in the map later. The monopoly of trade was assigned to Seville. At first, it was a government institution, the so-called Casa de Contratación, but later on, they put up the Consulate of Merchants of Sevilla. And a lot of the functions of the trade devolved upon that institution, which was the Guild of Merchants of Sevilla. So it was later on a private institution that was in charge of the fleet system. Later on, when Sevilla got silted over, they transferred the port to Cadiz. And so there it is. It was meant to supply finished goods to Spanish America in exchange for gold and silver. There was a single port regime. Only one port was allowed to receive the goods. In the case of New Spain, that port was Veracruz. In the case of the West Indies, that was Havana. The West Indies are all these smaller islands, like where Cuba is, Hispaniola, what is now, what's that? Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and the very tumultuous country that's half of it. Anyway, look it up. Haiti. That is part of the West Indies. And then Portobelo, which is in Panama, to serve Peru. Okay, single port system. And what was involved was the flota or fleet system, which meant that the shipments of the goods, as well as the gold and silver coming back to Spain, the shipments were always in a convoy. And the reason for that was that they needed to be protected by ships of war, men of war, against pirates and other hostile nations. So, that's the flota, the Indias, and this is an illustration, more or less contemporary, of the many ships that were involved there. There were two viceroyalties of Spain that were important. New Spain, which was formed in 1535, and that's basically from here upwards there. Later on, Louisiana was included. There's even a little province called Nuevas Filipinas, sometime in the 1700s. So New Spain is that part. Peru, what is called the Viceroyalty of Peru, is this entire part. They just divided it later on into the Viceroyalty of New Granada and the Viceroyalty of the Rio de Plata. So they relegated the Viceroyalty of Peru to this narrow strip, but originally there was just two. All right. So I was saying the center of attention was always Spanish America. Why? Well, take a look at this. This is Madison. I don't know how Madison does it, okay? He tries to estimate GDP. Everybody's using Madison anyway. He tries to estimate GDP per capita and aggregate for these ancient territories. A special attention should be given to New Spain. Look, its GDP aggregate, according to Madison, is even bigger than the UK. And it's very close to that of Spain. And in terms of per capita, it's also not very far away. What's the bottom line? Well, if you talk of the rest of Spanish America, that will refer mostly to Peru. Also the same thing. And these are just pictures of the great contrasts between people who lived it up in the colonies and those who had to do the work. So this is a famous depiction of the mines in, I'm not sure if it's Peru or New Spain. I think this must be New Spain, and this was is in Peru. And this is a picture of a lady that is dressed in a silk. The silk will have come from the galleon trade. The thing is, even lower class people were able to wear silk and satin. You can see this is a white person and his wife, who is black, and they have a mixed offspring. Uso yan sa Mexico, you're classified according to the proportion of your black or white ancestry. So, this is Coatsworth, who wrote the history of Latin America. He says, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the most prosperous regions of the New World probably generated per capita incomes at least comparable to and probably higher than the most advanced regions of the Old. So it's not strange that the focus of the trade would be Spanish America. That was the price. Okay, I had some spare time, so. This is where do they end up? They ended up in Veracruz, right? But from Veracruz, what happens next is you do overland, you go overland to reach Mexico City. And on the other side, it ends up in Acapulco, and guess what? It also ends up in Mexico. There's a central role played by Mexico City. We keep on stopping here at Acapulco. That's it. Well, it reached at Acapulco, and that was it. But who were the real agents involved? What was the real trade involved in the galleon trade? That's not in the textbooks anymore, right? But here you can see the geography is already suggested. But in any case, in the early years, and this is also not emphasized, in the early years of Manila anyway, from about 1575 to 1593. That's also not an, maybe even 1604. Not an insignificant period of time. It was unrestricted galleon trade. The galleon trade was unrestricted. What does that mean? We could send as many ships as we wanted to Spanish America, especially New Spain. Maybe in some years there were 3 in 1 year. At other times 2. This is a contrast because later on, and we'll see why, the galleon trade is limited to 1 ship a year. But there was a period when there were no rules, and we were able to send several ships a year. So who is we? Well, I'm saying we because we live here, but it's not we. It's Manileños together with Mexican capital.
But it was not monopolized.
Not yet. It was not monopolized yet. There were no rules. So, but in particular, you would conjecture that if it had been left that way, Mexican capital would have come in to produce the ships. Later on, the binding constraint would be the cost of constructing a galleon. And we already read that they're all done in Cavite or in Subic even. No? But that's regulated construction. And the nice part about that later on is that it's shouldered by the king. It was a state enterprise. But initially, you would expect this is not shouldered by the king, or maybe some of it were galleons that were reused, but if you let your mind wander, what would Mexican capital have done if it had not been regulated? It would probably have, and it was already happening in the early years, embarked on very many voyages at a time. Okay, and this is from Azcárraga, whom I started with. But you have to be very careful with Azcárraga because he's an advocate. He's an advocate of free trade. And therefore, in a way, his opinion will be colored by that advocacy. But in any case, his viewpoint, which seems, logical in a way, he said that before the galleon trade was regulated, the colony, Manila particularly, was rich. He says, money was abundant, bars of silver coming from Acapulco, and gold powder being exported annually in large quantities. We were exporting gold powder. Why that disappeared is another story. Okay, but the picture that he's proposing is that Manila was an emporium at that time, where of their own accord, ships from various nations were coming in because they knew that there was silver going to come, brought by the galleons from Acapulco. And those same ships would carry off their goods to Spanish America. So that's his picture. This is just something that caught my attention. Azcárraga mentions an event where the education, so he mentions how many pious foundations, the Obras Pias, were founded during the early years. How many colleges were founded during the early years. And he's saying that the educational establishments that arose in the first century can be judged, the luxury displayed in the city during those times can be judged by the celebration of the inauguration of the Jesuit University. Oh, sage. Attended by students wearing bonnets covered with pearls and fine gemstones. The graduation paraphernalia at that time, it's like parang a soft hat. But then the picture, I can't find the picture. Okay? But you can imagine, people just hanging randomly, precious stones. Uh, in the U.S. they start putting things on their toga, right? And then they wear lace, like that. Uso yun sa America. Imagine in those days, what they were doing was putting precious stones in their vestments. Now, okay, is Azcárraga exaggerating? Well, I looked for another source, and that's, Gabi, ito na naman, si De La Costa, sage, okay? De La Costa mentions something similar. He differs with Azcárraga in the incident. De La Costa is talking about a feast of the a celebration of the Immaculate Conception. Azcárraga is talking about the inauguration of a university. So even De La Costa says, the Spanish scholars wore their academic gowns of tawny silk, kind of brown, with facings of fine scarlet cloth and shoulder trimmings of lace, and their caps, eto na naman, their caps ablaze with gold and precious stones, and their necks hung with jeweled chains. Clearly, in spite of official moanings and groanings, their parents were not doing so badly in the galleon trade. So that's the picture, right? Of course, we need corroboration. We need more. No? But it's part of a puzzle, and we have one piece. It looks credible, but we need more reinforcement. Okay, in any case, that regime of unregulated trade is interrupted by regulation later on. And in order to understand why, let's discuss a bit of mercantilism. But this is mercantilism that, well, for want of a better term, I termed feudal mercantilism. And, okay, pictures. This is a picture of the Habsburg seal. This is Charles V as an emperor. It's Charles I, Carlos I as a king of Spain. And this is his son, Felipe II, for whom the Philippines was named when he was still parang Prince of Wales, the Prince of Asturias at the time. His father, Charles, was the king at the time. Okay, it was still prevalent under the Habsburg. And what did it mean? It was a system of giving privileges to autonomous entities like cities, guilds, no? Merchants' guilds, town guilds, no? To administer territories in exchange for what those entities can give the crown. And what those entities gave the crown was revenues. Essentially, one of those entities could be a tax farmer for the crown. And you give the crown a share of the taxes that you collect, and you keep the rest. And in exchange for that, you give these entities monopolies. And Sevilla, the Merchant Guild of Sevilla, which I'll talk about later, was one of those entities. Initially, these entities, merchant guilds, set out to administer justice, settle disputes among their members. But later on, they also helped the crown in financing its wars and basically its revenues for whatever purposes it needed. But originally, you read Heckscher. Heckscher's famous two-volume work is Mercantilism. No? I don't know, some of you may have read it. He says, this was a logical system from the viewpoint of a country or territory at a time when travel was hard. You could not police or administer very large territories. So you devolved the authority to smaller entities in exchange for privileges. Like a town, this is the usual story in economic history, a town would be given the privilege of holding fair and administering its own affairs as long as it gave the landlord share of the revenue. It would also be expected to take care of the local infrastructure, repairing the bridges, repairing the roads, so local public goods. So that's the system of feudal mercantilism. And in the colonies, it relied a lot on, I guess, Robinson and Acemoglu and Robinson would call it extractive institutions. It would be to accumulate metal species through monopolized trade, right? And Sevilla, I'm running ahead of myself. Sevilla was like that. It helped the crown in many ways. It administered its own affairs. In particular, it organized the flota. So it's a lot of headache out of the crown's plate. No, it's off the crown's plate. And in return, it collects revenue. Okay. But for the monarchs, the imperative was the revenue, because you needed that to prosecute wars and to sustain elite consumption. A famous example of the feudal form of this was the Mesta, M-E-S-T-A, which is the Sheep Growers Association in Spain, where the sheep growers were given the rights to move their flocks from the north of Spain to the south so that the flocks could winter in a warmer part of the country. But in the process of doing so, they trampled on the agriculture of farmers. Why would the crown do something like that? There's a good transactions cost argument there. The argument is it's easier to deal with the few sheep growers than the many and dispersed farmers. And the taxation of the sheep was actually very easy. They were made to cross certain gates, and then you counted them. That was the basis of the tax. So in that case, this is the classic. There's been some dispute about how inefficient this was, but the point there was, in most of the writings on it, including Douglas North, the economic benefits were sacrificed for rents. So rent-seeking damages through economic efficiency. There are some authors who say, well, on the other hand, you can debate about which was more efficient at that time, the agriculture or sheep growing. But nonetheless, that's an example of giving rights to a guild or an entity in exchange for revenue. And that's what the Habsburgs were continuing. You have to imagine that this is actually, for Europe, this is a bit late in the game. You're no longer in the Middle Ages. This is the 1500s, 1600s. That's the Renaissance, no longer the Middle Ages. But the system persisted in Spain, and especially in the commercial sphere. The mercantilist arguments against the galleon trade were as follows. One, there was the outflow of precious metals to China, who were infidels. No. The only way you could have justified it is if you had converted China, then maybe it would assuage some of that concern. Second, there's competition posed to Spanish producers of textiles. Spain was already producing silk, as well. Europe was already producing silk also. Not all silk came from China at this point. And what was happening was a competition in Spanish America between Oriental silk and European silk. Third, there's a loss of revenue due to smuggling. The overloading of the galleons. In principle, even if it was not regulated, as soon as you got to Acapulco, you had to pay a tax. Parang import duties. No, they're not tariffs. Okay. It's based on the cargo. Okay, anyway, there was overloading of the cargoes, and sometimes the galleons would divert themselves to go to unrecorded places. Smuggling. I think Desiree Desierto, who's a colleague of ours, wrote a little paper with other people that documented how the overloading of the galleons led to a lot of shipwrecks. But you see, here's another point. Would that have happened if the galleon trade was unregulated? Would you have had to overload a galleon if the supply of ships was more elastic? Maybe. Maybe, maybe not. Yeah. So, and then, of course, the other sad point was that even European countries were exploiting the galleon trade by selling goods in Manila under false flags. So they will say, oh, this is coming from India. The goods are coming from India. But it's actually the capital of, let's say, the British or the Dutch. They would get shipped on the galleon and get sold for silver. So essentially, you were doing the shipping you were allowing the British or the Dutch or the French to sell to Spanish America because you did not intercept the illegal shipment of their goods on your galleon. Okay, so those were all objections to the Manila trade. And this is a graph from De Vries, who tried to document the flow of silver for this period, 1600 to 1650. So this is tons per year. So the square figures are the producers or the sources, and the recipients are round. So what does it look like? Japan actually was a source of silver for Asia. The problem was Japan and China were at odds. So Chinese could not get silver from Japan. And in fact, there was a time when the Dutch intermediated. The Dutch was able to get Japanese silver and then use it to buy Chinese goods. But the point here is that Japan is a source of silver. Okay. America, obviously, would be a source of silver. And that's the amount of it that De Vries estimates to have come and gone to Europe. Okay. Some of that Europe received also went out to the Baltics and the Levant, the Middle East. But some of it also went back to Southeast Asia in the form of the trade that they had. So, for example, the Portuguese would also obtain gold and silver from America, send it to Europe, and then use it to purchase spices. The Portuguese were in the spices trade more than the silk and porcelain. Okay? However, in addition, there was this thing from Acapulco to Asia. And if you look at that figure, that is anywhere from 8 to 14% of the silver that is produced in America. Of course, you would... Spanish America, yeah. Spanish America. So it's something to worry about. If you were the feudal mercantilist, you would say, why is that leaking? Why is that leaking out? What you want is for you to sell goods to America and for them to pay you. That's all you want. But there is this leakage. The Mexicans are buying Asian goods, not from the Spaniards, but from the Manileños who were selling Chinese goods. Okay. So what happens is that Felipe II issues an order that's a landmark order, 1593. He says, by the way, pardon my translations. These are all just translations. No? If you want the original, baka marunong kayo. This is the original, okay? He says, is this the main thing? No, this one first. Because it is suitable to allow commerce between the West Indies and China, meaning Spanish America and China, and to moderate that of the Philippines, which has grown so much, reducing that of these realms, Spain, we prohibit, uphold, and command that no native or resident of New Spain or of any part of the Indies may do business in the Philippines. Mexicans cannot participate in the galleon trade. So essentially, he's creating a monopoly for Manila. In the way that these people typically think they can do things. Well, we just give them the privilege. That should allow them to subsist. Oh, problem solved. All right? And another part is also significant. He says, as a kindness to the residents and inhabitants of the Philippines and to preserve the commerce to the extent that it is sufficient. Baligtad naman, only the Manileños, I don't want to say Filipinos because they were not Filipinos. Only the Manileños can contract in New Spain in the manner stipulated by other laws, so that they themselves must bring their effects there. So he's trying to impose a quarantine on Mexicans. Don't get the business of Manila.
So it's that left part that you're cutting.
Yeah.
In the first slide, right? The left.
No, it's okay to, the loop is maintained. The loop is maintained. But what he's saying is that Manileños can get their Chinese goods in Manila, and they can bring it to Acapulco and get paid in silver and bring it back to Manila, and the thing goes. It's a cycle. You continue to maintain that level of trade between Acapulco and Manila. But only the Manileños are allowed to benefit from it. Not the Spaniards, not the Mexicans. The Mexicans cannot, for example, the Mexicans cannot invest their money. It's the Manileños have to go to Spain, they earn money, and then they invest it again in the Manila trade. They buy Chinese goods, then go back to Acapulco, make more money, then go back. So the point is to preserve, is to create a monopoly of Manila. So, to summarize what is contained in that decree, these are the things that are stipulated. First, well, the other thing is, Manileños cannot go to China either. You have to wait for the junks to come to Manila, which is the system that Legazpi arrived at. No? Only Manila Spaniards are allowed to engage in the Acapulco trade. The rights to cargo must be distributed to the community of Manila. This is the so-called, you learned this in grade school, the boleta system. Everybody gets a share. So it's like a welfare system for the Spaniards in Manila, right? You get a share of the cargo. And then, because you have a share of the cargo, you can buy Chinese goods and then you can profit from it. That's the crude way in which it was conceived. And in order to restrict the trade, he allowed only one ship, outfitted at royal expense, with a fixed value of cargo and a fixed value of the rate of return, 100%. Okay? So it's even specifying the rate of return. Can you really do that? And you participate in a fair in Acapulco to sell the products to Mexican buyers on an arm's length basis. So the system envisioned is Manileños or their charges would go to Mexico, go to Acapulco, and wait for the Mexican buyers to bid on the cargo that they have. Get paid in silver and then go back. Okay? And the other thing is no galleon goods should be sold to Peru. It's obvious because Peru is supposed to be supplied by the flota. You cannot muscle in on the fleet system that is a monopoly of Sevilla. Okay. So, again, Azcárraga speculates, or maybe he has basis to say this. He says, Manila declined after these regulations. So he says, it used to be a happy place. By the end of the 17th century, all was poverty and trouble. The white population remained small. Commerce languished within the narrow circle of its mahirap i-translate ito, periodic expeditions to Acapulco without attempting any kind of exchange. He would have wanted the Philippines to go to China, the Manila people to go to China. And poverty was reflected even in the garrison troops that did service barefoot and shirtless, committing frequent robberies of Chinese stores, which long ago became a source of vexation for people of the country. Again, Azcárraga, he's an advocate. Is there any basis to any of this? There's a scholar out of the University of York named, I think, Deborah Mawson. And she did a study of the conditions of soldiers stationed in the Philippines. And it seems to corroborate what Azcárraga was saying. The Philippines was not a nice place to be assigned to. And most of the people who were assigned here were from Mexico. And she talks about how you had to draft people almost forcibly. Ang tawag doon is Shanghaied. Or you got prisoners and told them, parang sa Russia, if you fight Ukraine, you can get your commutation. That kind of forced service. No? Oh, this is interesting. In 1604, he's already passed the restriction, the Council of Manila claimed that the soldiers in the islands were dying of hunger and forced to beg and sell their arms to support themselves. There was a lack of available sailors and pilots. So that's I think we need to dig more into this to see how deep this was. No? Oh, here's another thing that I came across. There's a decree of, I think this will have been, siguro si Felipe pa rin ito, Felipe. No? This is in the compilation of laws. He prohibits the practice, which means it was existing, yeah, of forcing the Chinese to sell chickens, at below market price to officials. A country that is bustling will not have officials who will stoop that low. Which only means that things are bad. You're having to rob the Chinese community. So, okay. So this kind of dispels the idea that all throughout the galleon trade, it was smooth sailing and it was lucrative and all that. No, it tells you that there may have been ups and downs. There was also social stratification. Even though some people got rich, the vast majority only accumulated an average fortune over the course of their lives. A lot of people actually sold their tickets or boletas, which means they were not really traders. They just got bought off for the parang reservation wage so that other people could use their boletas, which shows you as kind of stratification of people who could independently pursue the galleon trade and those who could not. This is quoted by a Spanish scholar, one of the two big sources that I relied on, Yuste Lopez, who said that at the end of the 18th century, Martinez de Zúñiga said, trade in the Philippines is not enough to make many rich, but it's enough to make a living. So there is a social stratification there, no? Now, okay, so that's the picture thus far. I'll introduce a new element, which is the consulados, the consulates. This is not consulates in the sense of approving your visas or passports. No. This is a guild of merchants. And I list here the consulates of Sevilla. I think this is Sevilla, because that is Isidore of Seville and his brother, okay, the patron saint. Mexico City, I look at the cactus around the seal. Lima, this one is Lima. I think it was as early as Pizarro that did that. And then Manila, 1769. You notice the gap. Manila did not get a consulate until 1769, and I'll tell you why. This have to be authorized by the king. You get a charter. Okay. The important part is that the Mexican consulado was a key player. And from the geography, you could already see why. It was in the middle of the trade in Veracruz and in Acapulco. And it exerted control over both Acapulco and Veracruz, the fairs that took place there. One trick that they did for Veracruz was when the ships, the flota would arrive, they would not show up immediately. They'd make them wait. And so, what would happen is, at a certain point, the ships have to leave again, so they would wait until the last minute before making a bargain with the flota, which means the prices have to be dropped. Okay. In Acapulco, they had an even more active role because, you know, the name of the guild in Mexico is Universidad de los Mercaderes de la Ciudad de México en Nueva España y sus provincias del Nuevo Reino de Galicia, Nueva Vizcaya, Guatemala y Yucatán, y Socomusco y los reinos de Cartagena, Perú y las Filipinas. Under tayo dun sa guild na yun. So they could do pretty much what they wanted. If you think about it, they were a monopolist because they have a monopoly of the internal market in New Spain, as well as to a lesser extent, but also still in Peru. But they had two sources of supply. So let's assume there's only one demand curve. You combine the New Spain and Peru. But you have two. One is from Spain, two sources of supply. One is from Spain, one is from the galleons. But it's limited in amount because there's a quota. So what happens here is that you have to find the average of the two, solve for the proper proportion so that it's equated to marginal revenue. And you will find that and you will get the usual P and Q, and you divide it between what you buy from Spain and what you buy from the galleons. The galleons is cheaper, but it's not unlimited in supply, so it cannot be the complete replacement of E. So, there's a report by 1715 that kind of looked at this, and they were saying, and he said, Linares is the viceroy of a viceroy of Mexico. I'll say Mexico para madali, even though territorially it's not always exact. He says, the new Spanish role in the trans-Pacific trade causes a grave harm to the commerce of Spain. The Mexicans show great interest in the Manila galleon because of its low value, which satisfies the common popular market of New Spain, which tells you the silk is not just about the elite consumption. It's so cheap that you can sell it to ordinary people. I showed you a picture of not elite person who was wearing satin. And the result is nobody wants to buy from the flota, obviously. And here I will just document a few contemporary statements. So ranging from 1586, fairly early on, up to 1776, where they say that the Mexicans actually dominate the regulated trade, even despite the regulation. So this one is nice because it's, but the same guy, si Linares, he says, the Manila residents send the cargoes as if they were theirs, though they belong to Mexicans. And the Mexicans remit currency as if this belonged to the Manileños as proceeds from cargo that was not theirs to begin with. Pinapaikutan ng mga Mexican merchants yung galleon trade. What can you do? These are sophisticated capitalists already. Yes, Toby.
I'm still confused. So the regulation, looking at the second slide with the map that goes this way, right? The regulation cut disallowed, first of all, Acapulco, Mexico. In other words,
No.
there should be an arm's length thing.
No. No. The merchants can buy from Acapulco. In the system envisioned, a Mexican, how did Philip II envision it? What he wanted was the Manileños with their Oriental goods would come to Acapulco. The Mexico City merchants would go to Acapulco and buy.
Right. No, I mean, before, kasi there was Ladahan, thing like that. So in other words,
Yeah, they would go back.
no, I understand. No, before that happened, right? In other words, there is a land-based thing that there was unrestricted.
Yeah.
Right? But now,
The land-based thing is not restricted. What was restricted is the ocean route.
also,
Huh? You only send one ship.
I thought kasi the issue was to stop the direct trade between Spain.
To stop the participation of the Mexicans in the trade as capitalists. Yes.
Precisely to that point, paano nangyari po ito na parang si Mexico yung kumikita when the intent was to stop them from...
Because the intent was not being fulfilled. The Mexicans were smarter than the rules. Yeah. They underestimated the creativity of the Mexicans. I'll look into a few cases. Huh?
No, if you can just, I'm really...
Oh, sure,
No,
Toby.
kasi, for example, the before regulation was that I'm always going back to that
Yeah.
now because that was where all the lines shed, right?
Oo.
Maybe you can, okay, so what did Felipe,
Layo eh.
second slide, sorry. Hindi ko makakita eh.
Okay.
Where did he cut the flow?
He did not cut the flow. He rationed it.
In one slide you said, Spain directly trading with China is disallowed. That's
No. Manila directly trading with China is disallowed. Okay.
Spain, that's why I get confused. There, no direct
Spaniards. Well, even Manila, Spaniards. Who are the Spaniards in this region? The Manileños.
No, I understand.
The only point of this bullet is to say that the Spaniards in Manila cannot go to China to get goods there.
Okay,
They have to wait for the Chinese junks to come to Manila.
okay. So,
Part of that is security. They were afraid that it was not safe to do that, that they might be held hostage, things like that. They considered China a hostile entity.
got it. So of all those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullets, it's actually bullet number 4, which was the issue, which is the binding constraint.
Yeah, but this one is also important. This was the idea. Remember, the galleon trade was a concession so that this distant colony of the Philippines would have something to live on. And they were supposed to do that and that was supposed to be achieved by Manileños monopolizing the trade.
Manileños meaning Spanish.
Spanish.
Okay, so that's okay.
Intramuros.
So this second bullet, without restrictions, would have read both Mexican Spaniards and Philippine and Manila Spaniards.
Can engage in the trade.
So when you say Mexicans, it's Spanish. The
News.
Spanish in the
Kaya nga new Spanish. Mexicans.
yeah,
Okay.
it's but of Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. No,
it's really
yeah.
indigenous in Mexico at that
Yeah.
time. Okay, so I see. So it was the Mexican Spaniards who were now disallowed to engage. To engage in the Manila Acapulco.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
They used to, give the money and then get it back. They used to take short business trips to Manila, tell some, I'll buy these goods during the Manila Fair. Ikaw, you ship it, and then I'll wait for it there.
So it's restricting Mexican capital
Yeah.
in the galleon trade from Philippines to Acapulco.
Yes.
Got it. Why was Peru? Why is Peru an issue then?
Because it was also being supplied by the galleons.
Got it. Okay.
And they didn't want that to happen. Because they wanted Peru reserved for the flota, the European goods.
Okay.
Going through Portobello.
Yes.
The way they supplied Peru was Portobello, it's in Panama, overland and then go down to Lima. Okay?
Yeah.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so what happened next was, let's study the functions of these consulates. And I was saying that, you can see it already from the geography that the Mexican consulate could play a big role. First of all, they were geographically well positioned. Secondly, they had the money. The merchants you refer to here are the so-called, the English is not good. They called grocers, but in Spanish they're called almaceneros. You know almacen? Pen, de sarapen, cuchillo, de almacen. Almacen is a big store. It's a big store. It's almost like a warehouse. So what happens is these are wholesalers. They can sell retail, but they're also the source of these goods for the retailers in the smaller towns of Mexico. They are the big merchants of Mexico. That's why they're inside that consulado.
Sir, is there any evidence that Mexican businessmen co-opted yung mga Filipinos?
Co-opted? Then I'll talk about that. So, I did this already. Okay. The modus, here it is. The modus is, the Mexicans can obtain the right, the effective rights to ship by doing any of the following. One, they can send money to Manila. It's another question how you do that, but you do that by, it's very hard to disentangle who owns what in the silver that comes back. Because some people will say, oh, that's just profits that was not remitted in the previous trip. Yung pala, it's capital that will be lent to people in Manila or the agents of Mexican. I'm not vilifying the Mexicans here, but they're very smart, actually. Second, the Spaniards in Mexico. So they also invested money in the obras pias. That's not prohibited, but the obras pias can be persuaded to lend money to people who are the agents of the Mexican grocers. They can also buy up the boletas. As I was telling you, everybody gets a boleta. But can you really ship something? You're an old widow who... Akin lang yan. Ito, pera. And that was a system. You could live a fairly, not comfortable, but tolerable existence just by selling your boleta. Okay? So they then they, using this, or they could, here's something that's also important. They could qualify as Manila residents through family or work through Manila agents. In fact, some of them would send a member of their family to settle in the Philippines. There was a residence requirement to participate in the galleon trade.
So that's what I'm asking, sir. So, since malayo yung space sa Manila,
Ng Mexico.
Mexico, did the businessmen in the Philippines
Yes.
first were businessmen in Mexico,
Yes.
made their bones, and then
Yes.
somehow
Yeah.
transplanted to the Philippines? So there's this.
No, these are big Mexican merchants who saw an additional opportunity in the Philippines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So galing sila ng Mexico.
Oh, yeah.
Parang they.
Right. This is what's happening here.
Okay.
This is what's happening here.
But they're all Spaniards, right? They just
Yeah.
lived in different locations.
Yeah, but it's the crown that's making a distinction between the Manileños and the Mexican Spaniards.
And the reason just so we're clear, because they didn't like that leakage.
They didn't like the leakage. They wanted it to be limited because it's just a concession to Manila. Huwag kang umabuso.
Were there any documented letters between like businessmen in?
No, I'll give you an example. Okay, this is an important Mexican author, si Bonyalian. He dug up a list of names given by an investigation made by the Duke of Linares that said, these are Mexican or new Spanish citizens who are participating in the galleon trade illegally. He has a list of names. And why is that important? Why does it stick? He penalized them. These numbers are what they needed to pay. And the people who paid more than 1,000 or more, those are the big guys in Mexico. Are you related to any of these people? Tagle, he was almost Pope. Tagle, you know. So, in fact, this is just a partial list. There are other people whom he did not include because they were small fry. So it's a real business. And when was this? 1715. This is not just the early days. It was going on up to the 18th century. Okay? So they inserted themselves by making short business trips. Oh, this is important, by being appointed as administrators or soldiers or sailors. Kasi you qualify as a Manileño by doing that. And then you appoint agents among Manila residents, or you leave family members to qualify as residents. There are documents where you give your family member enough money to settle in Manila. Why? So you can be a resident and you can correspond with me to buy stuff. I'll send you money later on. It's capital, you buy stuff. You send it to me. Okay? It's fascinating. Oh, this is how they operate in the galleon trade. We kind of discussed that. But in Acapulco, they also had a role. Because bansa nila yun eh. So what would they do? They would simulate the sale to themselves in Acapulco. Because in principle, the fare in Acapulco should be arm's length. You haggle with each other when the cargo is there. But that doesn't happen in practice. So you simulate the sale to self, you participate in open purchase and sale. Sometimes it's really just, you're just you're just receiving or taking delivery of something that you already own. Yun na nga sabi ni Linares, they pretend to ship goods that are not theirs, and the Manileños pretend to receive money for goods that were not also theirs to begin with. Okay. So how do you settle? You receive, let's say you lent somebody in Manila. So it's a loan. How does he pay you back? You receive the loan payment through the sale. Once it's sold in Acapulco, he can give you the money at that point, right? Plus interest. And you can retain all or some of the profits in Mexico and ship the remainder of the returns to returning galleon. This is a nice case. You know, I don't know, do you know the street named Raon? It's not there anymore anyway, it's in Quiapo. It's named after this guy.
No, it's still there.
Ah, is it?
No, well, they call it Ramon, and they call it.
We changed it na yata eh. Dati-rate stereo equipment eh. Anyway, Jose Raon was a governor general. He was investigated for corruption by Simon de Anda, who's a famous governor general. I think he was not governor general, but British came and he defended the city at that point. So he was investigated, and there was a paper trail. His house was raided. They literally may recibos. Raon lent 7,000 pesos to a shipper. It's named, to purchase Asian goods and ship them to Mexico. So he's governor general. I lend you money. And then it's an explosive revelation. Oh, something's happening. Anyway, so the guy ships the goods to Mexico. And what he does, and this will answer your question, he pays the principal plus 30% to the Mexican merchant, Memije, who is Raon's agent there. Actually, they also uncovered further loans to other merchants. Raon was an operator. So a case was opened against him, reaching Spain, but he never got convicted because he died. He died before he was convicted. But the proceeds, they could trace where it went. Okay, so that illustrates how gains from the galleon were remitted to Mexico. Can be done. Okay.
Still does. I mean, in other words, the impact was not just on the Philippines side. It must have been also, on the Mexican, Spain side.
Impact in terms of? These are just private people wanting to make profit.
If you have 3 trips to one trip, no matter how much, wouldn't there also be a decline on the Spain side in some way?
Sorry again. If
Unrestricted trade where both parties were gaining. To restricted trade, even if there's smuggling on this side, wouldn't there be a decline on both sides? You can't make up.
well, I'm sure the Mexicans would have preferred an unrestricted trade regime. But the point is that even under the restricted trade regime, they were able to go around the rules and make most of the money. Not the Manileños.
Right. No, I'm
The-
just wondering if there was some decrease, like it was all poverty on our side, but wasn't there some loss?
No? Well, remember, Mexico is a very rich country. It's also not just being supplied by the Acapulco trade. If you recall the flow of silver from Manila is a lot smaller than from Europe. So it also tells you that we're not the big players here. Oh, the Philippines was not the big player here. Anyway, just as an aside, this part of the Mexican role in the country's history has not been thoroughly investigated. In fact, we rely a lot on Spanish sources, which I suspect we lost touch with some of the documents having to do with Mexico. I don't know why. None of the history books I consulted really mentioned this to any great extent. At most, they would mention that it was a problem in the early days, but they would say that the 1593 decree kind of stopped it. But that's not the case. it continued. Okay, so that's my comment there. And it's a wonder that we're so used to talking about the Mexico-Philippines link in cultural, religious terms, but we don't talk about the economic links. We know things like kamatis, yung ganon, flora and fauna, the fact that the Black Nazarene is a Mexican image, ganon. But we don't talk about the economic links. So this is what I dug up in the rabbit hole. But it changed. It's nice. It's a nice date, 1700. In 1700, there was a change in the regime in Spain. From the Habsburgs, you go to the Bourbons. And you're familiar with this guy. He's Louis XIV, the Sun King. And his famous advisor was not Stephen, but Jean-Baptiste Colbert, okay? The famous statesman and economist. Well, as it happened, the one who got appointed, one who got appointed king of Spain after the war was the grandson of Louis XIV. So he was basically originally almost French. And that's Felipe Quinto. And then his son is Carlos Tercero, male. But the connection here is that the Bourbons in Spain were heavily influenced by Colbertism, the Colbertism of France. That's the key link. And Colbertism as a kind of mercantilism is different from the feudal mercantilism I talked about. Basically, it's about centralizing power, centralizing revenue. The reason is still the same. They want to prosecute wars, they want to sustain luxury living, but they think that it's best done now, A, by removing the autonomy of these small entities, the guilds, the towns, people you gave monopoly privileges to, and letting the state actually collect the revenue. Secondly, there's also a sense that you can get revenue by developing the country. One of the important ways is to create a maximal internal customs area, meaning you remove all the obstacles to internal trade, even as you maintain the barriers to external trade. So that's Colbertism. And you can also earn revenue by developing agriculture and industry primarily through exports. This is mercantilism proper. The mercantilism that we talked about a while ago, it's kind of primitive kind, proto-mercantilism. They're united by their preoccupation with the balance of trade and revenues. No? Okay, so when the Bourbons came to power, that's, by the way, the coat of arms of the Bourbons. You notice this there? That's French, the fleur-de-lis. Okay? So, what they did was, these are some examples. They suppressed internal tolls and customs. It used to be in Spain as well as in France. There used to be, between one province and the other, like between Navarra and other Spanish territories, there were customs lines. When you move from one to the other province, you'd have to pay a toll. Internal customs, ang tawag doon eh, dry ports. They call them dry ports. Secos. He got rid of that because, well, that's a Colbertist agenda. Colbert did that. Of course, all of this idealizes it because in practice, they also only did it gradually and incompletely. But the trend is there, right? So one of them is to suppress internal tolls and customs, move this to national borders. External only. Create a huge internal customs area. The second, this is minor but interesting. You allow the flotistas to stay longer in Mexico. You don't have to come. We'll pick you up later. You remember the game that the Mexicans were playing, no? That they would not show up at the fair until the last minute so that the prices would go down. So this one says, no, you can stay as long as you like, until the next trip. And you can even distribute them if you need to internally. It undercuts the monopoly of the Mexicans. This is important. They allowed private ships to ply the Atlantic route. So it used to be just the flota from Sevilla to Habana, Veracruz, and then what's the other one? Portobelo. Now, no, you can just go if you want. That was allowed, partly because it was a response to a war situation. They didn't want the colonies to be under-provisioned, so they allowed that for a time. They felt that, of course, you lose the revenue to some extent, but these navios de registro also have to pay a fee. So some revenue is gained, but on the other hand, you're undermining the monopoly of civil. But you notice the way they're doing it is not by abolishing things, but by kind of circumscribing, doing other things that might undermine the existing pattern of trade. Again, well, they keep trying to do this. Stricter rules to prohibit Mexican capital from entering the galleon trade. So you try to control the cargo. Didn't work. Okay? Then, in addition, you supply American colonies with European and Asian goods. You're allowed to do that now. Well, a significant event was 1761. There was a war with Britain. And as you know, Manila was occupied. Habana was also occupied. And it got resolved by Spain paying a huge amount. But what that did to the Bourbons was that it made them realize the insecurity of this place. Remember, you could hardly persuade soldiers to come here. It was not a nice place to be in. So they said something has to change in the way we run this colony. So among other things, well, this is still the Atlantic side. They allowed trade between Caribbean and other Spanish ports besides Seville. But, this is called Bertis in the sense that as long as you're dealing with your own colonies or your own territory, you should facilitate exchange. But you should not still allow other countries to join that exchange. That's the idea behind that. And in 1769, which I'll discuss in a while, they formed the Consulado de Manila. What do you think is the reason for that? They want to strengthen the backbone of the Manila merchants vis-a-vis the Mexicans. 1778, they made a more systematic decree. This is, I think, now Carlos III. No? They called it the Decree of Comercio Libre. That doesn't mean free trade. That means liberalized trade within the customs area. So they allow trading between numerous ports in Spain and American colonies. They subvert the single port system. You can go anywhere. Except for New Spain. Except for Veracruz. Later on, it will happen 1789. They will finally include New Spain. The reason they excluded it, according to some writers, is that they were afraid liberalizing New Spain would attract all of the traffic to that very lucrative market, and the others would become undersupplied. All right. Oh, 1783, this is the other thing that we might still have time to discuss, is the Royal Company of the Philippines. And the purpose is to trade directly between the Philippines and Spain. So this is just how they dealt with the old structures. Now let's talk about the consulado. So this writer, Yuste Lopez, who's a very productive, prolific lady, says, in the long term, the purpose was to eliminate the participation of Mexican merchants. These are the rules of the Consulado de Manila. Only Spanish citizens, 25 years of age or plus, only professional merchants, proven assets, must have resided in the Philippines for 10 years, been born or must have resided in the Philippines. And if you're engaged in manufacturing or agriculture, you get double allocation. The intent is to professionalize the business by restricting it to high net worth persons. But that also means the consulado will now be in charge of distributing the lading spaces of the galleon. It used to be the Governor General. Now it's the consulado. And whom do you think they will distribute it to? Themselves, right? What that removes is that old romantic idea of a concession to the entire Manila community where everybody gets a share. The boletas. The Comunidad dati, Comunidad y Comercio de Manila. Now, wala na yung komunidad. They're tightening the ropes so that it's only people with capital who will benefit. Why? Because when you were distributing it to smaller fry, the Mexicans had some way of buying up those things.
It really sounds like they had something against Mexicans. You know, parang that's a political,
Maybe.
you know what I mean? Was it really
I'll show you another thing. I'll show you another thing. This might validate your point.
against the Mexican Spaniards?
In the original selection for the consulado, only 8 native-born Spaniards met the capital requirement. It's also telling you how poor the place was. Of course, you have to qualify that a bit. The war against Britain had just happened, so some people lost their assets. Now, Peninsulares, 40 of them passed both the wealth and residency requirements. It was relaxed for the Peninsulares. But there were 75 Mexicans whom they didn't allow in, based either on deficiencies in wealth or residency. In fact, a lot of the Mexicans made the wealth requirement, but they failed on the residency requirement. But, you know, at that point, the galleon trade was in trouble already, even further trouble, so that to show you how poor the place was, they had to reduce the capital requirement. They also had to reduce the residency requirement. It's desperate stuff. So this is a different picture from that romantic picture of the galleon sailing across the seas, di ba? Oh, this is the Real Compañía de Filipinas. Oh, there's a famous painting by Goya, one of his largest paintings actually, that shows you a meeting of the Royal Company of the Philippines. So this is by Goya. If you look at it closely, Goya is really funny because he shows some people are dozing off, not paying attention. Look at it closely, it's a huge picture. So, okay. So it's founded by decree. Belatedly, Spain wanted to be like the East India Company, like Britain, East India Company. France also had the merchant company. And the very famous one of the Netherlands, the DOOC. I don't know the Dutch. For their Oost-Indiske, something like that. And the purpose is to regularize and to monopolize. It would be the only entity that can do this, that can export to the Philippines and monopolize the trade between Philippines and Spain. And it's allowed, see, this is new, it's allowed to sail directly to China and India. The Manila in the early days was not allowed to do that. They wait for the junks. But this is the wishy-washy part. You can reach Manila from Sevilla by going either east or west, but you must always return westward. You have a mental picture of that? Oh, I think I have a picture. And wait, this is important. It's required to invest in productive activities. Colbert, you must develop agricultural industry, lead it to export. Okay, so this is the way it is. This is the way it goes. So what happens is, this is the usual galleon route, China to Manila, Manila to Acapulco, right? Now, what can the Royal Company do? It can go from Cadiz to Veracruz, and then go down to Buenos Aires, go around Cape Horn, and go to Manila. And then from there proceed to China. In the early part of its stipulation, it always needs to go to Manila. What it cannot do is go back here. It cannot go back that way. It must turn around and cross the Atlantic. The Indian Ocean to get back to Spain. So it must always be going that way. Of course, it can always go this way and then back. Right? What it cannot touch, again, you see, it's preserving some of the monopoly half-heartedly. What it cannot do is go from Manila to Acapulco. What? Oh. Okay, so that's the route. What does that do? On paper, it did not interfere with the galleon trade. Sabi ni Carlos III, I permit the inhabitants of the Philippines to continue for the present. Parang he's doubting whether it will continue indefinitely, to continue their trade with New Spain. But it competed with the galleon, in effect, by, obtain Asian goods outbound, return to Spain. Yeah, I'll show you. What it can do is this. Okay, outbound, let's say you go there. To Manila, you get goods in Manila, or you get goods in China. You return to Spain that way. You can export it to Veracruz. It does not protect the Manila galleon. In fact, the galleonistas were very suspicious of the corporation. They were asked to invest. The king invested some amount in the corporation, and then he said, oh, as a kindness to you, why don't you also invest in the company? Nobody in Manila invested. They boycotted it. Okay, so that's one way they competed with the galleon trade. Or they could procure American goods outbound and then sell them to Asia. So, pwede rin yun. And they made investments in Philippine agriculture. This is significant. Like sugar, indigo, pepper, and so forth and so on. How did they do that? They contracted planters. They extended loans or advances to planters to do it. This was important later on because it was the same system that would be used by larger foreign merchants, the British, the Americans, when they were allowed to enter the country. But sabi ni Schwartz in a specific article about our Royal Philippine Company, what were they thinking? Why did they put up the company? Was it to gradually encroach on the galleon? Maybe. So he himself is wondering why that happened. Because it's almost inevitable that the activities of the company would eat into the business of the galleons. So, but contrary to the promise, it was a failure, but I call it a successful failure. Contrary to the promise, it competed with Mexico City and Cadiz. It oversupplied Asian goods via the Atlantic route. It ultimately, it's funny. It ultimately found direct trade with China and India more lucrative than investing in Philippine production. And at a certain point in 1793, it asked permission. Do we really have to go to Manila? I mean, we've been to China, we went around the tip of South America, got to Manila, went to China. Do we still have to go to Manila? Why don't we just go directly to Spain? You're adding to our cost. So they got that suspended so that ultimately they did not pass Manila anymore. But on the other hand, given its desire to secure Asian goods at lower prices, it persuaded the Crown to allow Manila to receive ships that were bringing in Asian goods, even if these ships were not Spanish or Chinese or whatever. Even European ships carrying Asian goods were allowed. Why? They wanted to depress the prices of the goods that they were buying in Manila, that they were going to export to Spain. It failed in most of its productive ventures. So what I'm saying here is that it did not perform according to how it was designed. It failed in most of its productive ventures because of insufficient capital, they made bad loans, they made poor investment choices, and their last attempt at investing in agriculture was abandoned in 1802. They were not allowed to invest in agriculture by their directors because they were bleeding money already. Okay, and they went bankrupt in 1834. So, failure. On the other hand, what? The competition in supplying Asian goods lowered the attractiveness of the galleon trade, mitigating the Dutch disease problem. And it is a Dutch disease problem, that the galleonistas were not interested in developing the interiors, right? Their lobbying led to lower prices. In order to lower prices, led to the opening of Manila to international shipping. And this finally led to Manila being opened as a free port in 1834. Its attempts at investment set the pattern for the way commercial agriculture would be developed by other more capitalized countries by extending loans to farmers. Yung tinatawag ng, what is it in our later literature, it's the interlinked credit markets. You provide a loan, you're owed, but you're paid in produce. Okay. The alternative links created between Spain and the Philippines and with Britain and the UK insulated the economy from the definitive end of the Manila-Acapulco trade in 1821. By that time, there was shipping coming from other nations. There were other activities. And it was the Royal Philippine Company that pioneered that. So, in a sense, it failed, but it led to new things that had more prospects for success, even if it was not under its own auspices. Now, I just want to go through this and then we're done. The other factors that were overshadowing the progress of both the consulate and the company were these. There were other trading partners that were trading directly with Asia via the Atlantic route. They did not have to go to America to get Oriental goods. They just went directly. There's more efficient shipping and improving order in the seas. You remember Douglas North's, what is that article? Growth of productivity in ocean shipping. He attributes the use of more of lighter vessels to the fact that piracy and privateering were minimized after a certain point, which was associated with the greater policing of the oceans by the great sea powers like the UK, the Netherlands. All right. So that was happening. Europe and the US were emerging as new markets. Remember, the focus used to be Spanish America, to sell there. But with the incipient Industrial Revolution in the 1770s, these other places were burgeoning, sourced new markets. Secondly, next, there was a decline in demand for the traditional Asian goods, like silk, porcelain. That's old hat. What was new? Tea, which is not in China. I mean, the British had managed to cultivate tea in India, and they were able to do that to sell it not to the Americas. Up to now, I think the Mexicans drink coffee. No? They sell it to Europe, the new markets. America, North America, Trump's America, that part. And then, this is important, the decline of metal specie as the sole means of payment. People were using bills of exchange. People were running balance of trade surpluses rather than doing triangular trade, like I mentioned the Dutch did, in order to finance their trades. They did not have to have that special access to metal specie that Spain used to think was its advantage. So the advantages of Spain, and by extension, the consulate and the company, were being eroded by these global developments. This is just a map, just to compare, no? This is the old map, 1600 to 1650. This is the new one. Where is it? The new one is this one. That one. You will notice this thing hardly changed. But this is much bigger. This is much bigger. What is happening there? The other European powers are able to source Asian goods through their own means, no longer relying on Spain or on the Americas. Okay? So, in summary, we can conclude that both feudal and full-blown Colbertist mercantilist policies failed to develop the country. And it's due ultimately to a Dutch disease affecting Spain and New Spain and indirectly the Philippines, which made entrepot trade based on privileged access to metal specie more attractive than investing in production. In addition, the Spanish merchants who dominated the trade had a diverted focus. Their focus is not to make money in the Philippines and get wealthy in the Philippines. It is to make money and get rich in New Spain and enjoy it there. Who will enjoy life in Manila if you had all of that money, right? The ambition is to go back to New Spain and ultimately maybe the peninsula. And that encouraged capital flight and discouraged capital accumulation locally. The local Spaniards failed to step up even when they were given the privilege of the consulado. They still, you remember, they got double allocation if they had interest in agricultural industry. That didn't work. So what happened was the central regime saying, let's get a new set of agents, which is the Royal Company of the Philippines, to develop the country, because the consulado cannot do it. Even with protection against the Mexicans. But even the RCF was victim to that Dutch disease. So it failed. It abandoned development projects and concentrated on trading. It was an explicit decision of their board. Stop investing in these agricultural projects. You're losing money there. Just concentrate on the China-India trade directly going to Europe. Never mind Manila. So, meanwhile, other countries, the UK, France, the Netherlands, took better advantage of changing demands, better navigation, financial innovation, and that nullified the advantages of both continents. And it's the failure of those mercantilist projects that led to the subsequent abandonment of mercantilism as a whole and the adoption of a more liberal regime for the Philippines under Spain. Manila was declared a port free to receive international shipping from 1834. Coincidentally, the same year that the company died. The company got bankrupt. So that's the brief story that I had.
Epic. Okay. So So are there any questions from the group, Toby?
Is it possible, because when I was looking at the story, it sounded to me like there was some, issue between the mainland Spain and the Spanish in America, in Mexico, right?
Oh, sure.
And wait, and everything that happened was to prevent the new Spanish from getting too big. So, the first regulation, right, it was really to prevent Mexican capital, so that's one. And then even the subsequent regulations, when you were saying that they allowed more than one ship except in except in Veracruz, because as you said, they were worried that it would get too big and so forth. And that continued in your story. So I'm wondering if, your second bullet in the end, that we were like almost collateral damage because the royalty did not want New Spain to get big. They wanted it to remain, subject of whatever.
Well, to the first point, I think you're right. There is that, I
In
don't
other
know
words,
how to call it. There is that rivalry, if not even animosity, between the upstarts that were the
In
New
Mexico.
Mexico merchants and the older merchants that were in
Yeah.
Sevilla.
No,
they,
it's just-
they regarded it as their privilege to
Right.
get rich at the expense of of New Spain. And the Philippine outlet or vent was something that they needed to control so that the Mexicans would not get too big.
No, I understand, but it wasn't really. They didn't restrict trade because anyway, Philippines was just it was just a concession to the Filipino Spaniards.
But it was, yeah.
No, but I'm saying the bigger issue, the bigger thing was to prevent Mexican capital from
Yeah,
getting
but
bigger.
you have to look at it from the viewpoint of mercantilists. Even aside from animosity with respect towards the Mexicans, it did not make sense for a mercantilist power to give away a lot of that revenue and metal specie to something that they did not profit from. So, independently of whether it was Mexico or not, it was a leakage that they needed to stop. So, it just so happens that the Mexicans were the ones benefiting from it.
No, I guess what I'm suggesting, it wasn't,
The other
at
part-
that time,
the
it
other
wasn't
part,
really
Toby, is,
mercantilism.
the other part of it, Toby, is I'm also ambivalent about what would have happened if we had let the galleon trade remain unregulated. It would have gotten much bigger, but would it have developed the country?
I know, but if you were saying that the Mexican capital would have come in and they wanted to stop that, that certainly was a fear of theirs, right?
Yes.
No, I understand. All I'm saying is that I'm not sure it was because of mercantilism. I'm not sure. I think it was more, there was something else going on. That's
Something
what it
racial?
sounded.
I don't know.
Not racial,
But-
because these were Spaniards in New Mexico.
Yeah, but they're not peninsulares.
I understand. It-
They're not Spanish enough. And of course, later on, this would boil over into the Mexican Revolution. And the galleon trade would definitively end, unlike the textbooks say. And the galleon trade, as an official venture, probably ended in 1815. But ships kept on going, traveling between Manila and Acapulco up to 1821. Private ships. So there were still some juice to be squeezed out of that lemon, even up to 1821.
Sir, question. Could you explain a little bit about the Dutch disease that you mentioned here?
Yeah.
What is the Dutch disease exactly, and what's the connection between that and relying on
Well, as you know,
versus
yeah.
production?
As you know, the Dutch disease is also known as the booming sector phenomenon, where a very, the language first. It refers to the discovery by the Dutch of oil in the North Sea. And I think this happened in the 1960s. And when that happened, there was a huge expansion of foreign exchange reserves, an appreciation of the currency that hurt manufacturing. Now, we're using it in the broader sense here of a booming sector that, I think it's Corden that does it this way, that draws resources away from the tradable sector into a non-tradable sector. So in this case, The booming sector is the silver mines of Mexico and Peru. And the Mexicans, well, first of all, the Spaniards, because they had this resource, actually suffered from it because their manufacturing and their industry also got affected by the fact that their consumption could be financed directly simply through the extraction of metals. And so that's a case where the tradable sector suffers. It was true for Mexico as well. They lost a lot of their indigenous industry because their silver could buy goods from Europe, could buy goods from Asia. And in the Philippines, we contracted it as well because it was so easy to just, mediate between the Chinese and the Mexicans. No need to develop agriculture. So I was saying, it was a blessing in disguise that the oversupply of Oriental goods and the fact that they later fell out of fashion to a degree reduced the returns from the galleon trade, so that when new activities started to arise, there was enough interest in it from the locals to participate in it. Of course, even so, you can tell a more detailed story that the people who benefited from the time, and this is part two of a talk, the people who benefit from the opening of the Philippines to third country actors like the UK, the US, so forth and so on, were the Chinese mestizos. And also the Spaniards to some extent. But that created the stratum that ultimately became wealthy and later thought of independence from Spain. Ganon din actually nangyari sa Mexico, is that the Criollo class. It was not, Criollos are the Spaniards who grew up or were born in Mexico. Here the Criollos were a smaller group. The larger group here we were more mixed, as it were. Chinese mestizos, Spanish mestizos, at saka Indios. They were the ones that made up the revolution. And the improvement in the social conditions of this stratum was a great factor in the aspirations for independence. Ironically, it's because of the liberalization of the trade that this sector became large. I point that out in the paper. So, in the Philippines, because it was not something that Spain needed to protect, they allowed the foreigners to come in. Liberalization. In Spain at that time, they were very protectionist. So it was the other way around. On the other hand, later on, this is the 1850s, 1870s, Spain at that time had become very liberal in politics. Spain itself. It's what Sarkisian calls Rizal's Spain, the Spain that Rizal wanted the Philippines to emulate. And yet the policy of those same liberal governments in the Philippines was to be repressive, to subsume us under a phylocracy. They had abolished the monasteries and suppressed the religious orders in Spain, but they had to rely on those same people to keep us under control. So in politics, it was opposite. They were liberal in politics, repressive here. In economics, they were liberal here and protectionist at home. And I think that created the revolution.
Thank you, Sir Noel, for the excellent study. To what extent would you attribute the underdevelopment of the Philippines under the Spanish colonial rule to the trade and commerce policies? Put another way, what aspects of this entire trade policy would you tweak, or what would you see, or what do you think should have been changed or modified so that we could have benefited or boosted growth and development over all those years?
You know, that's a hard question because you have to know what you're trying to maximize. And again, by taking a global view, you can make comparisons. What does it mean to develop agriculture and industry for a colony? You might say Cuba was fairly developed in the sense that they imposed a huge plantation economy using slave labor. It's developed in that sense. It's high output per person. In the Philippines, basically, for a long time, it was neglect. There was very little growth, but on the other hand, and I know there is the polo, the bandala, the tributes. On the other hand, the degree of exploitation in the Marxian sense is probably not as great as in the other colonies, such as Indonesia under the Dutch or India under the British. They were more developed in a sense. We were relatively neglected. And that's why older people like Benito Legarda would say, yeah, but we were not enslaved. Mexico was fairly well developed, and you can see that, right? But what did they have to go through to do that? They had to work in the mines, they had to suffer disease. I mean, the ordinary people, it's a very unequal growth. So, it's a hard question to answer in that sense. Knowing what was possible then, or what was current then, in the way that these colonizers administered their colonies. Which model would you have preferred? None of it is pretty. It's either you're neglected and you don't develop, or you are exploited heavily and you increase GDP. There is nothing in between.
The RCF model, isn't that something in between? Like trying to develop, they did it for tobacco.
No, it was actually, tobacco is different. That was the brainchild, not the brainchild, that was the initiative of Basco. And it was not for trade. That's why I didn't talk about it that much. It was for internal revenue. What he really did was to force certain, we used to all smoke tobacco. That's also something we got from Mexico. But what Basco did was to prohibit some provinces from consuming their tobacco and only planting tobacco. Why? Because they could sell the tobacco to other places in order to make revenue. It was basically a fiscal move. But it was cruel in the sense that, you deprive people of the choice of whether to plant rice or tobacco or both. You are restricted to just one crop. So is that development? I don't know. It raises output per capita. But it's badly distributed. You can say, could it have been otherwise? But you're working with history. You've seen other models in history where it was different. That's bad. They were just confiscating the opium.
Okay. But later they were...
No, it's these early days.
Sorry.
It was exploitative, the British rule in India. But it raised income per capita. Wala silang human development report.
How about the British in America? Were they brutalized?
No, that's a good question. There's that long literature about why colonization resulted in something different in the what do you call that? Because Mexico is also North America. North America versus Trump America versus the lower parts of North America and even South America. Well, sino ba yun? What's the name? Egerman and Sokolov. They had that paper about whether you were planting wheat or planting labor-intensive things like sugar, whether you were sparsely populated or heavily populated. So these are factors that determine whether the kind of system that you develop under colonialism is very oppressive and not. Well, then there's also Asimoglu and Robinson who say that it's also population density. That the British arrived, I don't know if this is true because this is disputed also. They killed a lot of North American Indians. But the thing is they arrived in a relatively less populated part, and you set up states which have governments that emulate the ones that they came from, and therefore you have more citizen participation, democracy, and so forth, which leads the government to be less oppressive and less extractive.
They did kill. I mean, they were the ones who were killing Native Americans.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. became independent way later, right? So the British, the French were hired to fight them and all that. So it was the Brits.
So the point is,
No, I mean, you said, no, they were killing them. You said, no, they were.
no. No, the population of North America is something that has not been fully established there. North, ganon. As opposed to where you observe the great civilizations like the Aztecs and the Maya. There are certain books that say that there are civilizations in North America that have not yet been fully studied. And therefore, the extent of extermination, you might say, or contraction of disease might be underestimated in that part of the map. Just talking about population density. But those are the kinds of factors that people look at when they say, oh, in this part of the world, it seems to be less extractive. In that other part of the world, it's very intensive, high population density, so forth.
Okay, so as epic as this
Sorry for keeping
as
you.
this lecture was, we thank Dr. De Dios for alam ko may part 2 pa to eh. Ang kapal ng this is the paper oh, nasa kalahati pa lang. But thank you Sir Noel for gracing us. And it's always a treat if you come here and present your paper. So thank you so much for attending, everyone. There's snacks on the back, but there's some QR code here that you have to answer first before you partake. Thank you so much. We'll be seeing you in our last Friday seminar for this semester next week.